So thank you so much for for be here at Chicago Roboto. Unfortunately, we are not in Chicago, but I hope you can be there in 2022. I'm really grateful to be part of the conference, and today I'm going to talk with you about effective testing strategy in Android. But before I start to talk about testing strategy, let me introduce myself. My name is Natan Ximenes. I'm a senior software engineer Android at League, and also we are hiring. So if you have interest in any positions, please you can check at our website. And I'm from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Um, I've been working with Android over the last 6 years, and I'm passionate about digital products, agile, and testing. I love to read and to learn more about it besides my interest with Android. And I'm a big fan of Brazilian football, NBA, esports, and I watch and I don't know everything that Marvel and Star Wars release. Usually, I'm watching, even though it's not that good, I'm always watching. And also, before I start, I want to thank you, Monica, for her awesome presentation. I hope I meet everything that have teach it to us today, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. So, strategy. I'll start with the meaning of the word strategy. So, according to the College Dictionary, is the art of planning the best way to gain an advantage or achieve success. So, strategy is about planning the best with the resources we have to achieve a goal. So, it's about being efficient. And when it comes to testing, it's pretty important to think about the resources you have and try to be the more efficient as you can, because we should know that untested software shouldn't be delivered to production. Otherwise, the users might become the testers, and usually we see that things that usually doesn't went as we expected. So testing is something that's really important to take care about what our users will actually interact with our application. And when it comes to testing strategy, instead of thinking about testing only about the testing types that are possible for you to apply in your application or the testing tools that you may choose to use, so Mockito, JUnit, Expresso, it's important to think about testing in a more structured way, in a way that we think about the bigger picture. So when I think about testing strategy, usually it will be about what we can actually test it, how can we test it, and it needs to be thinking about testing and what we are going to test without any personal bias influencing. We need to focus on software specificities, and we need to be aware of possible points of failure. So I'm going to talk about each one of these topics. So what to test? It can be any component of an application. It might be a function. We know that with Kotlin, we have functions that might live outside classes. It might be a class, a application layer, a screen. It can be anything. And usually, you will create testing for each of these components when you create one of them or when you make some changes. And how are you going to test it? It's going to be a combination between the testing types or any testing tools, where depending on the test type that you have a different testing tool. So usually when you if you are learning about testing, you'll see that the most common types of tests that are applicable are unit testing, integration testing, and UI testing. There are also other types of testing, but usually these three are the most common for you to actually see applied in an application. And also, when we are thinking about how we're going to test our apps, our application components, we need to think about each type of testing, what's the goal of each of them, and see if we can apply in your application. And that's where your architecture and the design of your class will be important, because if you have an architecture that doesn't follow good practice, or you have a project that has a lot of classes that doesn't have enough decoupling or doesn't follow good practice like solid principles, that will make hard for you to actually take control and isolate your application components. It will be harder for you to try to apply some specific types of testing. So sometimes, even though if you wanted to apply all types of testing, depending on how your application is structured, it might be hard for you to try to apply one of them. And when we think about testing, and we are deciding what to test and how we're going to test it, it needs to be impersonal. So to give an example, let's say that I'm a senior software engineer, or I'm a specialist, or I'm a tech lead, or I'm a Jedi. I don't know. Let's say that I am someone that have a lot of experience with a specific topic in Android. And if I am implementing a new feature, or I'm changing something, and I decided to not to apply testing because I think that I'm too comfortable with the programming language, or the business logic, or the context, in a way that I I I I won't apply testing, because I think that I have enough experience to create something without testing it, because I trust that much on myself. That's not a good thing to do, because when we are creating something, first, we are not implementing something that's for us, it's for the users, and also we are working in a team. So we have different people that have different experiences that might need to touch that piece of code that usually we have worked before. So it's not about us, it's not about me, it's about what's necessary for us to try to make sure that the code works as expected, in a way that's repeatable and it's automated. And that's where the testing actually fits, because with testing we can have a way to make sure that the things that you have changed or created work as expected, and it won't be tied to our thoughts or our skills. And also, we need to think about what to test and how to test in a way that's we're gonna we're gonna focus on the facts, and on facts, and not on personal taste. So things like, I prefer to use unit tests rather than integrated tests, or I prefer to create UI testing than integration tests. It's something that usually we shouldn't go in this way, because that's not a good thing to do, because we need to look at our application and try to see what's possible to apply. So if you have an application that you can apply unit testing, integration testing, and UI testing, and the resources that you have available, when I talk about resources, I mean your CI system. So if you have a CI that have a way to execute parallel builds, and the build time, it's not a problem for you. So you have a way to apply the most types of tests available, and then you can actually try to ensure that your application works as expected. But do it thinking about the facts, about what is possible, and not about things that you might like, because sometimes you might like a specific testing library, or a specific testing tool, or a specific testing way. And it's, if you think about things about what we like, we're gonna do things for us, and usually it's not for us, it's for the clients, it's for the users, it's for the team. So it's a team decision. And that's why quality can be taken for granted. It needs to be ensured, and the test is our way for actually ensure that things work as expected. So after you decided to create your testing, and you have decided with your team without bias influence, then you need to have a way to have a single source of truth, and that's what is your documentation. It needs to be a guideline where you have you have suggestion or orientation about naming styles, which tools are going to be used, which testing types, and how these testing types are going to be applied. And that's something important, because the whole team can have the same style to create something if they are working the same code base, and it will be easier to have collaboration. Because if you have if you work in a company where you have a code base that's quite a big, and you have different feature teams, if you have different styles or different tools or different types of tests being used, it will be hard for you to actually collaborate or to change to a new team without the problem to try to understand and try to learn everything again. But when you have a good documentation, you have a single source of truth, it will be easier for everyone to collaborate in the same code base. So it's pretty important. And also, you need to take care about your documentation in a way that it's updated frequently. And when I mean documentation, it's not about only about testing. It can be about anything in your project, in your production codes also, because we know that the users might change over the time. We know that the product might change over the time. Your team might change over the time. The company might change. And if you don't update your documentation, it will be something that will actually bring value for you for a while, but then it won't bring value, it won't add value for what you are implementing. So have a documentation, but make sure that it's updated. Another thing that's very important is to take care about the software specificities. So there are things that might directly impact the way you will implement your test. So if you have a different framework, or if you choose to go to a specific concurrency approach, depending on how your architecture is structured and how is implemented your dependency injection, you might have things that will differ in the way you implement your tests. So the way you configure your testing, the way they will be executed, and the way that you do your assertions. So for example, let's say that you have an application that is implemented with coroutines. And when you have an application that you are using coroutines to do asynchronous jobs or asynchronous operations, you have a lot of suspend functions, and we know that if you are comfortable with coroutines, that suspend functions should be executed inside a coroutine. So your tests will be executed inside a coroutine. But if you change your application from a coroutines approach to a Java approach, you won't have to actually specify how your functions that use Java strings will be executed. But you will need the help of Java to do the assertions in these functions. So depending on what you choose to use in your application, you have your tests being changed in the same way that your production code will change. So before you adopt a new framework or a library, take care about your testing in the same way that you take care about your production code. So I think if this new library or this new framework have some guidance or some guidelines about how your tests are going to be executed with this new approach, see if actually won't make your tests more complex to be implemented. Try to figure out with your team if the whole team are actually comfortable with this new approach. And if you have a positive uh, outputs of these questions, then okay, you should adopt it. But if you don't, maybe it's the time for you to try to figure out how this new framework or this new library will impact in the way you develop your application and how you develop your testing. So you have you'll be sure that this new adoption won't break anything. Another thing that are very important to take care is the points of failure that an application might have. So there are some points of failure that might happen in the app, and there are others that might happen outside the app. So when it comes to points of failure in the app, there's a few examples like side effects in the core of the application. So if you work in a code base where you have some specific module or internal library or maybe a specific class that are reused by different parts of your application and or different features, if you change something in this part of your application just to meet a new requirement for your feature, if you don't take care about how this change can impact other parts of your application, you might have some side effects that won't you will be no, that will be noticed only in production, because if you don't have a way to try to figure it out, if a new change doesn't break any part of your application, it might be a problem that no one will actually notice. So that's some problems that might happen when you have a big code base. And also, the crashes are one of the things that usually we are we are familiar with, because uh, when you're implementing an application, and we need to take care about exceptions, and we know that if you don't try to actually have a safer implementation of what we are doing and don't try to figure it out, the points of application that might lead to a crash, we might see it only in production. And sometimes there are some crashes that if even if we try to implement our application in a safer way, even if we have testing, there are some situations that only happen in specific devices or specific situations. So we might have these problems, and there are some there are some approach that we can do to try to avoid the situation to happen. So, um, what can we do for points of failure in the app? One approach that I really like is the smoke testing. The smoke testing is not a new type of testing. It's just a different way for you to actually separate or to execute the test that you already have. So you will create a new step in your CI where you try to execute first the tests of your application that are from the core of your application or the sensitive parts or the most important features of your application. When you have the separation, it will be easier for your team to be aware where something stops to work as expected. Because if you have just one step for testing in your CI, actually it'll take more time for you to try to figure it out what have failed and what failed. So you need to have, it's good to have smoke testing because you have a way to have a quicker feedback for the most important parts of application. And then you can try to fix and try to figure out what can you do, and your team will be aware to not create something that might break in the core of your application. Another thing that I hope you all are actually familiar with are crash reporting, because as I have said before, even with all the care that we take with our implementation, we might have some situations that might lead to a crash and we only notice in production. So having a crash report tool will help you to track when things doesn't work as expected, and you have a very clear information about the part of the application that isn't working, and also you have specific information about devices and states and whatever might help you to fix this problem. Another thing that are very important to have are feature flags. Feature flags are a good way for you to make changes in your application without the need to release a new version of your application and need to wait for all the review process of the Google Play. So when you have feature flags, we have a way to have two different implementations of a specific feature, and you have a way to switch between them or turn on or off, and also we have a way to release this new implementation, this new feature, to a percentage of our users in a way that we can see that when we turn on this new feature, if things doesn't work as expected or we don't have crashes, and then we can keep increasing this percent in a way that our users will have access to a new feature in a safer way. Another thing that are very important are phased releases or staging release. With this approach that's available in Google Play and I guess in the App Store in the same way, you can have a way to deliver the new version of your application in a way that instead you release it to 100% of your users, you have a way to release for a small portion of them for a specific percentage. So in this example, I don't know if it's clear for anyone to read, but here in a this application has a lot of users, but it was chosen to release for 10% of these users. So first 10% of them will have access to this new version, and then if things works as expected, and you can have a way to actually watch your Crashlytics or in your analytics, you keep increasing this percentage, so you have a safer way to release the new version of your application without the problem that you would have if you had released it to 100% of them. And there are problems that might happen outside the app. Usually are problems that we don't have control over it. So it might be an internal backend failure. It might be an external service or SDK failure. It might be unstable mobile network. And sometimes we can actually reproduce these problems in our development environment. And even with tests, we can actually try to avoid them to happen. So what can we do to try to prevent? Um, a good exercise to do is to expect that this external or internal service or these external SDKs might fail, and try to think about researching what this problem will represent for application if it happened. So it's a good way to figure it out if you need to actually try to create a specific workaround, or sometimes it's just a good feedback for your users with guidance for them to try to recover or try to find a different way to do what they usually do with your application will be enough. So there are some situations that usually we don't expect that happen. So let's say that you have an application that uses a specific and a very famous SDK, and this SDK never failed. But we know that sometimes situations that are external to us might happen, and when it happens, it might represent a bigger problem. So always when you have something that's it's outside of your app, try to figure out if this stops to work, if this will represent a bigger problem for your application or not. And another thing that's very important and also it's very helpful is incident post-mortems. When you have an incident post-mortem, it's just some teams do a meeting, or there are the teams that have a form, I don't know. But the meaning or the goal of a post-mortem is to talk about and try to figure out what have actually led to the problem that happened in production. So instead of thinking about the person who have created something that wasn't working or that led to a crash or to a problem in production, the main focus is the problem and how can we avoid the situation to happen again. So your team will try to figure out the root case of this problem that sometimes we might have a way to fix some specific crashes, but sometimes the problem isn't only the crash. Sometimes it might be a problem in the process. Sometimes the problem might be something that maybe a conversation with your team might solve it and might actually solve the problem in the roots of it actually happens. And another thing that's very important to talk about is the testing pyramid. If any of you have read about testing, you might have seen something about testing pyramid. So is it a testing strategy? The testing parameter, it's a ITU, testing type geometric distribution, where 10% of your tests will be you have 10% of them being UI testing, and 20% of them will be integration testing, and 70% of them will be unit testing. So this separation, this distribution of testing are based on the execution time, the fidelity, the maintenance and debugging. So the more you go up in the testing parameters, the more fidelity you have. So it will be more closely to actually who will be executed in your application or will happen in production. And the more you go down in the testing parameters, you'll lose fidelity, but actually it takes less time to be executed. It will be less complex to be maintained and less complex to debug. So that's why usually you have more unit testing than UI testing, because unit tests are easy to create, to maintain, but the problem, and I guess not a problem, but I believe it's not a problem, but also the trade-off is with unit tests, you don't have enough fidelity as you will have with UI testing. And that's why you need to have a balance between types of testing in your application. But when you think about testing, the testing parameter, and considering everything that I have talked until now, we can see that the testing parameter is not actually a test strategy. It's part of your test strategy if you wanted to apply it, but by itself alone, it doesn't represent your test strategy because it's just a guidance of a specific number of tests, a specific percentage of types of testing that you should have in your application. But it doesn't have usually different types of testing. So the approach that I have talked a few moments ago about the smoke testing, usually you won't find it in a testing parameter. And also specificities about how your application is structured or possible points of failure that usually you can try to avoid with testing, but sometimes testing won't be enough for you to avoid the situation to happen. So it doesn't have these informations in testing parameter. And sometimes it won't be actually applied because if you are implementing a SDK that doesn't have any UI capabilities or any features related to UI, how can you apply testing parameters? You only be able to implement integration testing and unit testing. So you can apply actually the whole testing parameter. So it's weird sometimes, and that's why you actually should look for the testing parameter as a guide and try to apply when actually it fits what you need. But sometimes you have different ways to distribute your testing. One of them are the testing parameters, the testing trophy. It was proposed by Kenzie Dodds, and in this distribution type here, the main goal is to have more integration tests because it brings more fidelity. Because with integration tests, you have more parts of your application being executed, being simulated at the same time than you will have with unit testing. So, and also, sorry, also, when you are implementing, when you are executing integration tests, it will take more time than the unit test should be executed. But depending how you configure your integration tests, it won't actually take that much time. So it's a good thing when your focus or your test strategy is try to have more fidelity and be more closely to what will be executed in your application or in production. Also, Kenzie Dodds believes that static analysis are a type of testing because depending on how you configure your linters, you have a way to try to avoid some specific problems while you are writing your code. So it's his proposal. It's a different way. There's no right or wrong. There's just what you or your team wants for your application. And another variation is the bug filter proposed by Noah Sussman. In his proposal, it's still using the testing parameter, but here, instead of look at the testing parameter and just focus on a specific percent of testing, it actually think about and actually focus more about the problems that your types of testing might avoid, might prevent you to actually have it in production. So if you have a way to try to reproduce some specific weird behavior and try to avoid with unit testing, then you create unit tests. But if you have a better way to actually try to prevent this problem to happen with integration testing, you go for integration or UI testing or any type of testing that will apply for your possible bug or your possible behavior that you need to try to reproduce to prevent it to happen in production. So the main focus here, it's about behaviors, is about how each type of test can help you to avoid some problems. So again, there's no right or wrong. It's just a variation. It's just what your team actually choose to do. And so when it comes to testing distribution, it's all about adding value. So depending on how your strategy to testing is implemented or what it's possible for you to implement in your application, you need to focus on the specific points that there are the execution time, fidelity, maintenance, and debugging. So depending on what is possible and about your team can do in the moments, focus on what's the best for you. So if your resources in the moments actually only allows you to think about testing in a way that you have to take care more about the execution time because you want a quick feedback about what you are implementing, you sometimes you might have more unit testing. But if you have a CI that have a lot of parallel builds and there's no problems about pricing or any execution times concerns, you might have more. You have a way to implement other types of testing tools. So you might go for integration testing or UI testing. It will depend on what's possible for you and what your team thinks that's important in the moment. So go for your strategy, think about what fits for you and for your project in the moments. And if the testing parameter apply for your application, choose the testing parameter. But if it doesn't actually represent what's best for you, then you go for a different variation and you'll be okay. To finish everything that I have talked and to wrap up, so testing is important, but it needs to be well structured. And it's not about you, it's about the application. So our personal taste shouldn't actually influence on how we implement testing. And sometimes testing by itself, it's not enough. We need to have different ways to try to make sure that our application will work and have ways to trace when things doesn't work in production. And the testing environment is not a testing strategy. It's not something that's useful. It's useful. It's something that can be part of your testing strategy, but you can have a different way to distribute your testing. And for the reading, I have reading 2 articles about testing strategy because I know that I couldn't cover everything that I have to talk about testing strategy because we have a small time box. So if you want to learn more about testing strategy, you can go to my Medium blog. I have posted these 2 articles yesterday, so take a look if you wanted to learn more about it. And if you have any suggestions or any experience about testing that you want to share, I will be glad to hear more about you. So that's it. Thanks so much for having me today. It was a pleasure for me to be here talking with you. I hope you had a good time as I had it. So that's it. And here my contacts if you want to talk with me. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all that about testing. It truly is such an important thing to make sure we have reliable apps. With that, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Feel free to drop into the Slack channel effective testing strategy in Android, and ask any questions that you have there now, later, when you think of them. I see we have one question so far, and that is, I want to know how someone can get started with Android testing. I've not found any great resources for testing in Android. Do you have any resources that you found to be great that you can point to other people?
Yes, actually, I have them on my presentation. I'll share again. I have created a page on my Notion account that is public. So in this link here, where I put the reference, you can find a lot of resources about testing. So I have links for videos of other conference and articles and books, everything that you wanted to read and to learn more about testing, not only in Android but in testing in general. You may find here. So I'll send here in the chats, but I'll send also in our Slack, so it will be there for you to try to find what's may be helpful for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.